This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 772 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. At the end of the 2011 football season, there was talk all over the internet about the importance of quarterbacks in fantasy football. That season had seen some really good performances from the position. Aaron Rodgers scored over 26 points per game with 45 touchdown passes. Drew Brees had over 24 points per contest and 46 touchdown throws. Cam Newton was a beast. Tom Brady was great. Matthew Stafford had a good year. If you had one of those 5 quarterbacks, you probably had a good fantasy season. Those 5 quarterbacks shifted the fantasy football market entirely. You had analysts putting articles together at the end of the year stating that in 2012, you needed to get an elite quarterback. And the only way to do that would be to spend up. And that irritated me. It was one season. There was tons of data and logic that showed that drafting quarterbacks late was almost always the move, not early. So I did something about it. At the end of that 2011 season, I started writing the Late Round Quarterback ebook. It launched in June of 2012, and that's what got me going down this path of being a fantasy football analyst. I hadn't done a thing in this space before that ebook, but thanks to the market reacting so aggressively to the 2011 season at quarterback, I was able to capitalize and start my career as a fantasy analyst. The year after those 5 quarterbacks separated themselves in fantasy football, we did indeed see a shift in average draft position. The 3 highest ADPs at the quarterback position since 2011 came during that 2012 season. According to my fantasy league data, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, and Drew Brees were all top 9 overall picks. They were all first rounders. And then Cam Newton and Matthew Stafford were second rounders. But after most of those quarterbacks scored over 22 fantasy points per game in 2011, none of them ended up scoring 22 points per game in 2012. None of them lived up to expectation when you compare where they were drafted and how many points we'd expect them to score at that ADP. From that moment forward, people became believers in the late round quarterback strategy. And for years and years in the 2010s, the strategy was foolproof. There were seasons in there where you could have literally just ignored the position during your draft and it wouldn't matter. It just didn't matter if you didn't get a good quarterback in August. But after years of late round quarterbacking being the obvious go-to strategy, we're seeing the market shift. And it's been shifting not just over the last year, but over the last few years. Back when Lamar Jackson had his MVP season and when he broke fantasy football, it was clear that the masses were starting to understand the importance of rushing in fantasy football. Jackson was a great passer that year, but his rushing numbers were out of control too. And that combination made him a unicorn. When something that amazing happens in fantasy, everyone notices. Everyone realized that season how important rushing was at the quarterback position. It forced me to write an article called "Did Lamar Jackson Break the Late Round Quarterback Strategy?" Now, Jackson himself that year was a late round quarterback, but because of his performance, the thought was that people would begin prioritizing the right things, and that Jackson himself and players like Jackson would finally be properly valued in fantasy football. The article was written in May of 2020, and it was an article where I started to detach myself from the very thing that allowed me to live out this dream of being a fantasy analyst. I began to detach myself from the late round quarterback strategy. At the conclusion of the article, I wrote the following. You know, the truth is, the question about the late round quarterback strategy in fantasy football this year shouldn't really revolve around Lamar Jackson. It shouldn't be about whether or not you're willing to take Jackson in the top 25 or the top 30. Instead, our focus should be on the fact that the fantasy football world has gotten smarter. In the past, a season like Ryan Tannehill's 2019 would have almost assuredly catapulted his cost the following year into the top 10 at the quarterback position. Yet today, the following year, he's being drafted as a mid-range QB2. Historically, fantasy managers didn't put a premium on quarterback rushing production. They ignored what's been dubbed the Konami code of fantasy football. We don't see that anymore. The consensus top 7 quarterbacks this year are all players who bring that extra juice with their legs. So no, Lamar Jackson isn't what could break the idea of drafting quarterbacks late in fantasy football. You are. As the fantasy football world gets sharper, the late round quarterback strategy may slowly morph into the middle round quarterback strategy. There's this thing in math called the coefficient of determination, or what we refer to as R squared. It's the proportion of the variation in the dependent variable that is predictable from the independent variable. It tells us to what extent the variance of one variable explains the variance of the second variable. An R squared of 1, or 100%, means there's perfect correlation. One variable explains everything about the other. An R squared of 0% means there's absolutely no correlation. Now, something I've done through the years is look at how well the fantasy football market does at predicting success at the quarterback position. And I use R squared to help determine that. Back in 2015, when you lined up average draft position versus postseason result, you'd find almost no correlation at quarterback. Meaning we were absolutely terrible at figuring out how quarterbacks would end up performing in fantasy football. That was pretty similar to other seasons in the 2010s as well. There wasn't much correlation between where we drafted these guys and how they finished. And when that's the case, what's the point in drafting one early? But since 2019, since Lamar Jackson's breakout season, those correlations have gotten so much stronger. The market has gotten smarter, like I talked about in that article. The quarterbacks that we draft early, at least in the top 10 or the top 12, they've been the quarterbacks who have ended up performing really well. That means finding late round quarterbacks has become increasingly more difficult. And when you look at the data, that's definitely been the case. Let's just use late to mean any quarterback drafted after round 7 of a 12-team league. After all, when I launched the late round quarterback ebook, that was the range that I considered late. That's when opportunity cost was significantly lowered. In 2022, 0 quarterbacks drafted after round 7 provided 20 or more points per game. Now, Justin Fields was close, but he didn't get there because of how he started his season. For some comparison, in 2019, 71% of quarterbacks who scored 20 or more points came from the late rounds. That number was 50% in 2018, and it was 50% in 2017. It was 0% last year. Just 25% of the quarterbacks last season who scored 18 points per game, which isn't a super high bar, came from the late rounds. That was at least 40% from 2015 through 2020. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that more quarterbacks are being drafted late during those seasons. In 2019, for example, 5 quarterbacks went in the first 7 rounds of a 12-team league. In 2022, we had 10. But that's also kind of the point. Going into a draft, you can't assume that you can just wait and hit on a quarterback who's going to give you high-end QB1 production, because the market dynamics have shifted. And that's especially true going into the 2023 season. We know that the position has become more predictable, and the reason for that is rushing, and I talk about that a lot in the late round draft guide. Fantasy managers are properly prioritizing the rushing component at quarterback. In turn, it's tougher to get valuable quarterbacks late. And the more seasons where this happens, the more we fail to see late round quarterbacks emerge, the higher the elite quarterbacks will get drafted the following season. And that's exactly what's going on in 2023. Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen are all roughly second round picks this year. The last time we saw a surge like this in early round quarterbacking, it was in 2012. And it's no surprise that last season saw similarly absurd numbers from quarterbacks as that 2011 season saw. If you look at how top 3 and top 6 quarterbacks performed in points per game versus the rest of their position, last season gave us the biggest gap that we've seen since, since 2011. The top 3 quarterbacks average in points per game last year versus the next 3 quarterbacks was 4.3 points better. So you're comparing the QB1 to the QB3 versus the QB4 to the QB6. That's the highest that we've seen since beyond 2011. The third highest rate with that group was in 2011. Then when you look at the QB4 to the QB6 and how many points per game they scored, last year that group was 2.4 points per game better than the QB7 to QB9. That was second best that we've seen since 2011 to the year 2011. What I'm essentially saying here is the advantage that the elite quarterbacks gave you last season was the biggest that we've seen since that amazing 2011 season. The season that got my career started. In 2012, what happened? Quarterbacks started getting drafted incredibly early. And what's happening in 2023? Quarterbacks are being pushed up draft boards to places we haven't seen in almost a decade. If history repeats itself, then that means that drafting Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, or Patrick Mahomes in round 2 this year will end up being a very bad idea. When the market is reactive to a previous season, you usually want to go in the opposite direction strategically. With that being said, this season is a little bit different, objectively. Back in 2011 to 2012, the quarterbacks who were being drafted early were all mostly pocket passers. Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Matthew Stafford. Passing numbers fluctuate year to year more than rushing numbers do. To help wrap your head around that concept, let me just ask you a very simple question. Assuming both players are totally healthy, which quarterback will score more fantasy points through the air this year? Justin Fields or Kirk Cousins? I'm sure a lot of you would say Cousins. I would say Cousins too. But I don't say that with 100% certainty. There's definitely a world where Justin Fields steps up, he takes a leap, and he throws more touchdowns than Cousins, even if the yardage doesn't match up. And those touchdowns could swing that number in favor of Fields. Now let me ask you this question. Between Justin Fields and Kirk Cousins, which one will have more points from rushing? Considering we're assuming that they're healthy, that answer is 100% absolutely Justin Fields. Rushing numbers are stickier year over year. And since we know rushing matters to fantasy scoring, we've known this for years and years, but the Lamar Jackson breakout really got the entire market on board. But since we know that rushing matters for fantasy quarterbacks, then we should have more confidence that this year's set of quarterbacks will have a better shot at repeating as top assets compared to the ones that we saw in 2012. Now, there is a big caveat here. Hurts, Mahomes, and Allen are going to have a hard time repeating what they did last year because high fantasy scores are just hard to get to year over year, over and over again. Any projection system would say the same. I've got them projected more in the 22.5 to 23.5 points per game bucket when they scored over 24 last year. And then all the while, the mid to low end QB1s, they're probably going to be better. Last season was the perfect storm of high production from the big three quarterbacks and then really average to below average production from the bottom tiered quarterbacks, the bottom tiered QB1s. That's why the elite quarterbacks had the biggest advantage in points per game that we've seen since 2011. Those numbers fluctuate and regress. It's why in 2012, it wasn't the same as what we saw in 2011. So we're sort of stuck in this place where, yes, we should feel confident about the individual quarterbacks that we're drafting and their ability to finish as top quarterbacks. But we should also feel pretty good about the gap between them and the rest of their position closing. So where does this lead us in 2023? Well, to me, whether you go after one of the elite quarterbacks should be largely driven by the type of league that you're drafting in. If you've got an 8 or a 10 team league, that means your team needs to be very, very good in order to compete. The fewer the teams in your league, the more stacked the teams are. So the better your team needs to be in order to win. So you can take a chance on a quarterback like that. In larger leagues, you can have flaws on your team and still come out on top. And in these larger leagues, your opportunity cost equation changes. If you're in a 14 team or a 16 team league, each pick comes with a larger cost because you have to wait longer for your next selection. More players are falling off the board. If you take one of those elite quarterbacks, you might think to yourself, hey, I'm going to really destroy the quarterback position in this league. My quarterback is going to be so much better than everyone else's quarterback. But you're not realizing that every team is starting more running backs and wide receivers too, at double and triple the rate because a typical fantasy lineup requires more of them. So my stance this season is that the elite guys are draft worthy in smaller leagues where teams need to be very good. Or honestly, in leagues where you know the competition isn't very fierce. In more competitive leagues or deeper formats, as long as it's a single quarterback league, I'm not taking on the second round opportunity cost. As I lay out in my guide, that's an area of the draft where you're getting substantially better hit rates at running back and wide receiver. And in deeper formats where more of those players are being started, those guys are unbelievably important. There are definitely parallels between this year and the 2012 season. The market is reacting to what appears to be a semi-outlier season at quarterback, pushing costs up for those guys. But unlike 2012, there's more of a reason for early round quarterbacking. Finding a late round replacement is much more difficult. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Now, if you like what you heard on today's show, there's more on this topic in the late round draft guide. The guide will help you navigate the quarterback position, and I provide quarterback targets for your draft this year as well. You can read more about it and pre-order the guide over on lateround.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you later in the week.